particular parent of interest to us is one of America's most interesting newspapermen, Dean Baquet, who is managing editor for news of the New York Times as of September something or other.
Labor Day, that's right.
Labor Day. And as befits a New Orleans native, Dean, I think, worked first at the Times-Picayune, where if I had the story right, a lovely young woman named Dylan came to interview with you. And soon enough, you all were off to the Chicago Tribune, both of you, as journalists at the Tribune. I want to get my dates right. You, after a distinguished career at the Tribune, you left and went to the New York Times in April of 1990 as a metropolitan reporter. You rose through the ranks there and were national editor of the New York Times when you came out here, saw the light, came to Los Angeles, and were with the Los Angeles Times for 7 years?
6 years.
6 years, the last 2 as editor. And then went back to the New York Times as Washington bureau chief before taking the managing editor's job recently. Remarkable newspaper man, really interesting guy, and the father of Ari Baquet, who's over here, a senior at USC. Wave your hand, Ari, we're delighted you're with us, and his mother, Dylan, right beside. It's great to have all of you with us. Dean's going to kick off by giving us a few thoughts, and then we look forward to Q&A.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up here only because it's easier for me to flip pages. Can you all hear me okay? Hear me okay? Raise your hand if you can't. Okay, that's good. You know, I never quite know how, and this is going to be, my remarks will be relatively brief. I'll try to stay with 20 minutes or so because I'd love to have lots of questions. Mainly because the advantage of doing these for me is that I get to hear what people outside of my newsroom think about newspapers and journalism and stories and coverage and the world. Because for those of you who have been editors, who are in faculty, and those of you who will one day become editors, the first shocking thing you learn is that when you become an editor, your world shrinks pretty dramatically, and you just know a lot less stuff. So this is a chance for me to learn more stuff. So I will be as quick as possible, and then I would love to have questions. You know, I never quite know what to say in groups like this because there are lots of questions you will have that I'm happy to answer about our pay model. I'm happy to answer questions about how the newsroom is set up. I'm happy to answer questions about what a managing editor does these days. But first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about something that's been on my mind for quite some time about coverage and news coverage in general. You know, sometimes when I speak at colleges, which I find myself doing more often these days, I find myself defending a profession that's been pretty battered, bruised, pretty well beat up, but not today. And probably you hear that a lot, but you're not going to hear that today. Today I'm here sort of triumphant. I want to extol a craft that in the past year, arguably more than any year in recent years, has proven itself absolutely essential. The stories of the upheaval in the Middle East and the tsunami in Japan are epic stories. Here's what happened in the newsroom of the Washington Post, which has actually been losing money. I asked the foreign editor of the Washington Post before I came here, because I figured you just didn't want to hear about the New York Times, to tell me what things were like in their newsroom. And here's what Marcus Broccoli, who's the editor of the paper, said to the Post. "Tell us what you need," Marcus said to the foreign editor. At the height of the coverage of the turmoil in the Middle East, the Post, losing money, had 15 reporters deployed in the region, including 9 stretched across an area that sprawls in the Middle East, 3 times as many as usual, reporters brought in from Metro, National, and Style with no nod to cost. The New York Times has had even more. The poor associate managing editor for budgets who works for me told me, "Well, we're over budget for the year, but you know, this is what we do." 2 New York Times writers and 2 photographers were captured by Gaddafi's men, and their account, which I think you should look up, which was published on March 23rd, 2011, was 2,711 words in the paper, and it is nothing short of literary history. Quote, Bullets flew around us, and the soft dirt popped. Tyler broke free and started running. Anthony fell on a sand berm, then got to his feet and followed Tyler, who for a moment considered making a run for it. They were bound, threatened, hit, punched, and headbutted, and after several days they were finally released to describe what they had witnessed. I asked David Kirkpatrick, who's a close friend of mine, who's the Cairo bureau chief of the New York Times and the person who has dominated coverage in the region, working nonstop from Tunisia to Cairo, what I should say to people who are students and in academia who are thinking about journalism. And here's what he wrote back to me. Quote, I'm now covering my third revolution in an Arab police state, believe it or not, wrote David, a slender correspondent who looks more like a lawyer than a reporter. He goes on in his email to me. Something I will never forget, he wrote, is the way in people in each one, terrorized for decades but about to break free, reach out to a member of the free press. When I say I'm a Western journalist, their eyes light up. Sometimes they're terrified, especially now in Tunisia before the revolution. But in every case, they treat me like talking to me is in itself an act of rebellion. And they feel it is so urgent to tell their story to the world. In Egypt or Tunisia, he wrote, they would sometimes say explicitly that they wanted to tell their story so that citizens of other Arab autocrats would be inspired by the news. In Tunisia, they ran up to me and pointed to mobile phone videos of themselves marching or rioting or even just milling around, and they would beam and point with pride. The people of Tunisia, the people of Tunisia. In Libya, where he was a few days ago, he introduced himself as a free journalist, and every day someone risks their life to try to tell the world and their fellow citizens that they're brave to say out loud, to say things out loud. Then there is the woman abducted and raped for 2 days by Gaddafi militias. When she managed to escape, she lied to a cab driver to get him to take her to the hotel housing all the foreign journalists. Talking to us is illegal, and she had to say that she worked there. It was the only place in Libya she could think of to go for refuge or justice. And when she burst into the door, she asked for the New York Times. But this is my favorite part, how he ended the email. But really, Dean, you should just tell them that this is a gas. I can't imagine a more fun job, and I know you know what I mean. And it is, in fact, a gas. This is a sprawling, epic story that only reporters can tell. This is what the Huffington Post cannot do and will never do. This is what can't be told by bloggers who never leave their homes. This is what can't be told truthfully or with authority by Fox News, whose Washington bureau chief admitted a few months ago that he exaggerated stories because he felt, quote unquote, impish. I'd argue that this epiphany, this sense that the best news organizations are absolutely essential, began when the planes went into the World Trade Center on the morning of September 11th. Imagine, if you will, that that story had been told by Vanity Fair or Bill O'Reilly. Something huge and hard to fathom had happened that would take all of the resources of the press to explain. It was a moment made for big news organizations with unwavering commitments to foreign news. I was home in Santa Monica, California. I was at the LA Times at the time, a few months after that, when the phone rang, and on the line was George Tenet, who was then the director of the CIA. Tenet is a gruff but charming guy. We made small talk. I told him I was planning on taking my son to an afternoon movie. My son was much younger than he is now. And that I couldn't make up my mind between the family film and the war movie. Tenet recommended the war movie. Boys like that kind of stuff, he said. Then he got to the point. The Times was about to publish the LA Times, a fairly explosive story about how the CIA was spying on the Iranian community in the U.S. as a way to learn more about Iran, where it had precious few spies. This story, Tenet said, would endanger lives. It would hurt an ongoing intelligence operation. Then he added darkly, it would hurt the war on terrorism. I told him that my job is to publish stories, not to kill them. He told him he couldn't tell me more, just that it would hurt the war on terror. By the way, I've had conversations now with people in the Obama administration and the Bush administration, and the argument's always the same. I agreed to hold the story for one day so I could at least have another look at it and talk to the writer. Then I went to see the family movie, by the way. The next day I called Tennant at his home and told him he hadn't given me a good enough reason to hold it and that we were going to run it, which we did. And in fact, nothing happened. The Washington Post in the recent years has published a story of how the government runs secret prisons abroad. The New York Times has run a story about the National Security Agency and its spying. And in each case, the government has opened investigations and made this argument. But so far, not a single bit of evidence, even in the case of WikiLeaks, which I edited, has emerged to prove that any of these stories has threatened national security. In fact, each of them has sparked important debates over the limits of government power. And I'd argue that in each case, it was the newspaper that was being the true patriot. All of that was a big drum roll to tell you what I really want to talk about today. And this is aimed more at the students than the faculty. But it's important, and it's actually the thing that I want to most impart in my career at this point. What I really want to talk for just a few minutes today is about the joy and the great craft of reporting, the beauty of craft, getting out and talking to people. My biggest fear as I watch one of the great seasons of triumph in covering the world today is not that newspapers will die. I'm not that romantic, to be frank. It's a business model. It's a wonderful, brilliantly evolved business model. But it's one that can be replaced by new technologies, so long as what comes next, reporting, witnessing, telling people stories, survives intact. My biggest fear is that the craft of reporting will be lost. I learned to report by trial and error, covering trials and making errors, in fact. As a young reporter in Louisiana, I hyped a story. Or rather, I was ambitious, and I let a bad editor convince me to hype a story. I was covering a rape trial, and the defendant was no doubt guilty. He was an actor who had lured women to his apartment with promises of movie roles. Then he assaulted them. Prodded by this bad editor, I described him as a two-bit actor. I filled the story with the kind of hyperbole that you now see on horrible crime reporting shows, and frankly, that you now see a lot in television, period. The next day, I showed up for the second day of the trial. The defendant looked at me, beaten. His lawyer just shook his head. Even the prosecutor, who should have been happy that I pilloried the guy, looked at me with little respect. I had learned a lesson because I had to face the people I wrote about. That's not a lesson I would have learned opining at home. So those of you who want to be journalists, and I'm not afraid to use that highfalutin term, the 4 journalists who were captured months ago in Baghdad deserve it. David Kirkpatrick deserves it. I have some advice. First, take the job that will let you learn to report. Reporting is more important than analysis. Without reporting, it's only guesswork. It's what bad reporters do. Second, learn history. Read about how the meetings in Paris in 1919 helped to shape the world, how the South came to be what it is today, how a bill becomes a law, how the discussion between India and Pakistan has shaped the modern world. Third, understand the difference between building a career and honing a craft. Young reporters always ask me, and I'm sure some will ask me today, whether they should take one job or another. And I always say, take the job that will teach you something that you don't know, that will take you to a place you've never been. Fourth, read, read, and read, and never stop reading. There's much to learn in history. At the height of the war in Afghanistan, one Thanksgiving when I was here as the editor of the LA Times, I asked the great Pulitzer Prize winner David Zucchino, who was in the mountains with the U.S. military, what I should read to get some understanding of what he was seeing. I expected that he would recommend some book of history. Instead, he recommended a story that was not even about Afghanistan. He told me that I should read Haji Murat by Tolstoy, which was set in the Caucasus in the 1800s. It's the story of a proud warlord and remains the most illuminating thing I've read about Afghanistan, even though it has absolutely factually nothing to do with Afghanistan. Finally, don't get caught up in your ambition and aspirations so much that you miss the process of becoming a journalist. The process, the years of hard work, of going to a place with your eyes open, of asking questions, is the true joy of journalism, wherever you practice. I grew up in Louisiana. My mother had a third-grade education. There were no books in my house. I'd never been on an airplane until I went off to college in New York. You're all entering the profession at a wonderful time, those of you who are entering it. Don't believe the doomsayers. You're going to revolutionize the profession. You're going to recreate a great profession at a time when it's more valuable than ever. And along the way, as David Kirkpatrick said, you will have a blast. So now I'll take questions. And I'll sit here for them. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. Question.
Anything.
Comments. Bryce?
Yeah. Kendall has an article, a profile in the New Yorker saying you're the most popular man and the popular person in the newsroom.
That's true. No, I'm just teasing.
I don't know if you've been really popular by your prognostications about journalism, but what do you see the New York Times as being in 5 or 10 years? Do you see it being an online publication? Do you expect to see a print publication in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah. I think. Can everybody hear me sitting down now? I think there will be a print New York Times for a long time to come. Certainly till the end of my career at the paper. I'm 55, so certainly for 10 years, if not longer. I'll tell you why I think that. There's no question that the web is going to has already become a much more important part of the life of the paper. But when we started charging for the website, which has been an amazing success. I mean, it's created a whole new source of revenue for the paper. But a lot of people chose to register, to pay for the website, and also acquire the Sunday print paper. So our Sunday circulation is actually going up. And we have I'm talking about the New York Times. I would say something different about other papers. We have a core readership of roughly 800,000 or so of the million who don't churn. And those of you who've worked in newspapers know a lot of newspaper circulation is churn. Our newspaper will report 300,000, but really it's 60,000 regular readers, and the rest are people who, buy it for a year, drop it, or enticed to buy it for a couple months and drop it. The New York Times has a core of about 800,000 people who buy the print paper, subscribe to the web, and that number has not gone down. I think I think print will be around for a long time. Not forever, I don't know, but certainly for a long time.
If I may just follow up on that, and then Gabriel will be sure to get to you. But I'm sure many in the room read the Ken Auletta piece in the New Yorker, which focused particularly on Jill Abramson, the new executive editor, and speculated, I'm sure correctly in this case, that Arthur Sulzberger was looking at 3 candidates, and really in the end 2, Dean Baquet and Jill Abramson for that position, and that he would have lost you had he not picked, in other words, let's see, what did he say? He would have lost Jill had he picked you, and this way he got you both. Talk about the article and what you thought about it. Certainly some interesting things said about Jill.
I thought...
That's what diplomatically.
I thought it's always, whenever people write about, it's always a lesson when people write about you, since we spend all of our time writing about other people. Right. I thought, the part of it that described my conversations with Arthur and Arthur's conversations with Jill were accurate. I think that, I actually think that I think Arthur made the right decision. I know that seems like a loyalist thing to say, but I think that Jill, who is a terrific journalist, had a lot going for her. I think you have to remember, I have not worked in that main newsroom since 2000. I left to come to LA in 2000. She had not only worked in the main newsroom, she's a terrific editor. She really is. One thing that I always dismiss is when people say she was selected because she's a woman. The reality is, if you had made a list of the 3 or 4 people who were ready to be editor of the New York Times, Jill would have been at the top of the list no matter what. I thought the piece, I would make the case, was a little hard on Jill, because I think that while even Jill would admit that some of the clashes it described were accurate, I thought it didn't capture some of the things that she had done that were more important to the paper, like the Reckoning series, which was in the aftermath of the financial collapse, which she championed. I mean, I think it could have dealt a little bit more with her journalism, which is pretty formidable. I didn't have, when Arthur called me to tell me that he had decided to pick Jill, my reaction was, excuse me, that's terrific. And when Jill came to New Orleans and we had dinner and she offered me the managing editor's job, obviously I thought that was terrific. I actually, being managing editor, I've now been a managing editor twice and an executive editor once. And being managing editor is about 1 billion times more fun.
Much more about the job.
It's much more it's like, it's like being, the coach versus the general manager. I mean, you get to run around with the players, and it's a blast.
I have to say, when I kept reading about all these difficult and imperious things that Jill did, 2 words occurred to me: Abe Rosenthal.
Except,
Quite a comparison.
well, I would say something important in Jill's defense. I do think that when women in leadership, I mean, the New York Times has had, and all newspapers have had, I mean, the tradition of the sort of cantankerous editor is a much more acceptable tradition for male editors than it is for women who become editors. So I would say in her defense, Abe I was not around for the Abe Rosenthal era, but Abe is portrayed by history as a tyrant. I don't think that's Jill.
No,
that's not Jill
exactly
at all.
what I meant. I was there
Yeah.
for some of the
Yeah.
interviews. So, Gabriel.
So you mentioned that the Paywall has drawn in all these Sunday subscribers, but that's because the way that the offer was made is that it's actually cheaper for you to get the Sunday.
That's right.
To get the full
That's
digital
right.
access. So how do you?
But
describe-
even as the offer has expired, when people have had a chance to re-up, they're re-upping. That's what I meant. And the only other thing I would say about forgive me for interrupting, but the only thing I would say about the paywall that surprised all of us, because we expected a sharp, dramatic drop in online readership. That didn't happen. There was a drop, but it wasn't a dramatic drop, and it wasn't a drop that the increase in revenue is significant. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I guess I was going to just ask, how do you determine success? How do you measure success with the paywall? And then beyond that, what other strategies are there available to you to gain back some of the lost revenue that you'll continue to see in the times of trade?
I think the measurement for success of the paywall is pretty simple, which is does it create an entirely new source of revenue that wasn't there before? Because remember, I mean, just for those, I mean, we have 2 sources of revenue. Let me back up 1 second. The reason the New York Times right now is doing better than almost any other paper in the country is because traditionally newspaper revenue, I'm going to swing back to, but I think this is an important bit of history for people who don't know it. Traditional newspaper revenue is advertising revenue. I mean, when people like me came up in the newspaper business, dependent on the paper, your revenue was 80% advertising. That's why newspapers cost a dime or a quarter. You weren't even paying the printing cost. All newspaper advertising revenue has fallen off a cliff. I mean, classified advertising, which at small regional papers used to be huge, is just gone. I mean, that business has almost disappeared. So most newspapers are now having to survive on a mix of dramatically reduced advertising revenue, hugely reduced, I mean, halved and worse in some place, and slightly increased circulation revenue, so they're struggling. The New York Times charges so much money for its newspaper that circulation revenue is now greater than advertising revenue, which nobody would
Is that
have
right?
predicted. Yes.
Print and online?
Yes.
Wow.
It's
Is
now-
that just true after the paywall?
No, that was true before. Now, lest you think that's brilliant, part of that is because advertising revenue went down. It wasn't that, I mean, circulation revenue was going up dramatically because the New York Times is, because so much of its circulation is national and people pay a lot, and there are not a lot of deals to buy the New York Times. You pay for it. So that's gone up like that. Ad revenue has gone down like this. Overall revenue has gone down, but for the most part, circulation revenue. So now we have a whole new source of revenue, which is web revenue. So success is it created a significant and growing new source of revenue without shrink. This is business success. I'm not, journalism success I can talk to forever, but I think you were asking a business success question. So here's how I would judge success. A third new source of revenue has been created while not scaring off enough readers to freak out advertisers. Does that answer the question?
So it hasn't cannibalized
No,
your
no,
online
no,
traffic.
no. Is that, I answered, okay.
Could we hear from some students? We got some great students here. I recognize it.
Oh, can I say just one thing? Because this is journalistic and business. The sky's the limit for future ways for national news organizations to make money online and do things journalistically. I mean, whether it's selling advertising on video, which the ad people at most newspapers now think is like a potential gold mine, because advertisers want to be on videos, to the simple fact that the amount of real estate you can sell online is huge compared. I mean, there was always a limit in print, right? It's X number of pages.
Not to belabor the point, but the fact that there's unlimited inventory is actually part of the problem.
It is part of the problem, unless you are I think the Journal and the New York Times are the only ones who can make this argument. Unless your argument is you're still selling something within that inventory that people want to buy that they can't get anyplace else, that's essentially the model. Sorry, go ahead. Students? Yes.
When you talk about it being a great time for us entering the profession now, and then also the revolution that you see taking place in terms of the craft, how do you see our generation of journalists keeping the integrity of the reporting and the craft of reporting during that revolution?
I think that the craft of reporting is timeless and is not going to change. What I see is, I mean, Michael Parks and I talked briefly about arts reporting, for instance, online. And I went out with one of our art critics a few weeks ago, and so I grew up in New Orleans, and if I read the New York Times and was not going to go to New York, and I wanted to read about the de Kooning show at MoMA, and I consider criticism, as high a form of journalism as war reporting. It's just different because it's explaining the world. So a person who wrote about arts, and actually, this is a space waiting for somebody to create a revolution, by the way. The craft of writing about art, if you go back and read the great art critics, half of it was description. Because I was never going to see. If I was somebody reading an art magazine, and I lived in Akron, I was never going to see the Jackson Pollock that you were describing in the 1950s, right? But now, and nobody's quite figured out how to write this way yet, there's going to be a whole new way of writing where you actually are about to describe something in a museum where you can actually then show it to me quickly and then write about it. I think that's a big deal. I think that in terms of more traditional kinds of reporting, I think that, for instance, coverage of wars and how reporters can keep the integrity is the same, right? You report the truth. You don't get spooked by the websites that just throw stuff up right and left. You're careful. You have to remain careful. But then you also have to indulge yourself in these new tools that didn't exist before, like video. I mean, the most powerful thing produced with the death of Gaddafi, for those who saw it, I mean, there is no bit of writing that could have described the first video that was made public, which was on our website and every other website, which was Gaddafi being manhandled by the people who captured him. That could not have existed, and that was available within. That morning, I was in my apartment getting ready to go to work when the morning editor called and said, "You're going to have to look at this so we can think about what to do with it." It was an easy call. We put it up, but that being available within such a short time, that's already revolutionized war reporting, right? You couldn't, we still speculate about scenes from historic wars, but that is the most chilling piece of history that you're going to see. So I think the ability to do that, the ability to take advantage of that, the ability to make that kind of video yourself, as long as you hold on to all those other things, I think you all are going to have I'm envious. So.
So, one of the problems right now is that there's so many Americans that are willing to believe these emails that come into their inbox about, Barack Obama's not a citizen, he doesn't have a birth certificate, things like that. And there's hundreds of thousands of people willing to pay for Glenn Beck, his stuff that he's spewing out there. How do you sort of create a demand for quality content? Because people are willing to pay for content if they're willing to subscribe to Glenn Beck's, online channel or whatever. What's the role that the newspaper plays in creating a demand for quality content and sort of bringing the knowledge level of the American populace up in this environment where they have 9 million options of where to go?
The truth is, this is the part where I said read history. There have always been Glenn Becks. There have always been, there have always been charlatans, and he's a charlatan. There have always been, and it's not an allusion to his, political standpoint. The fake tears, that's all, showmanship, bullshit. There's always been people like that in the media. They have a more available big audience because of the web and because technology lets them be seen more. But I still think, and I think there's much statistical evidence to back it up, that when push comes to shove, when people want to really understand their world in an active way, when there's a war, newspaper circulation and the websites of good journalistic institutions went up dramatically after September 11th. Nobody, I don't believe, turns to Glenn Beck in a moment of crisis. There's no evidence that they do. I think the main thing we are supposed to do is not be influenced by that, believe, as I do, that there's always going to be an audience for what we do, and that the Glenn Becks, there have been 25 Glenn Becks through the history of the New York Times, whether it's, there have been 25 people like that who are charlatans who come up and go down, but the great news gathering institutions that have held on to their soul, I think, survive.
My question kind of dovetails Paresh's. When you study journalism, the history of journalism, I think you find, at least from my perspective, that our idea of objectivity today is kind of a new thing, and that back then, reporters had clear opinions on what they were reporting about. And so I'm wondering if you think, and this is something that I've heard, the pendulum's kind of swinging back the other way, and now people are kind of going back to that older idea that reporters can have more color and opinion in their writing, and not be so objective today.
Well, I actually think objectivity is a worthy but almost impossible goal. I think the right word is fairness, and I think sometimes people mistake fairness for objectivity, because there are moments when objectivity doesn't quite work. But no, I actually would make the opposite argument. I would make the argument that there is now so much true opinion online. The easiest thing to do online, and you're hearing from a fan of online, but the easiest thing to do online is opinion. It just is. I don't need a staff or a budget to have an opinion about the war in Afghanistan, the economy, Barack Obama's parentage, Mitt Romney's religion. I can turn it on and give you an opinion about the de Kooning show, which I know nothing about, and do it all day. So there's tons of opinion online. What there is less of is hard-hitting, thoughtful reporting and analysis that derives from hard-hitting, thoughtful reporting. So I think that the onslaught of opinion online is going to raise the premium, and this is why I think people are willing to pay for the New York Times, is going to raise the premium for what I call fairness, because objectivity is just sort of hard. It's for what I call fairness. Does that answer the question?
We have a couple of questions back here. Yes.
I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on how tablets and smartphones have impacted newspapers. And I know you talked about how you believe that print newspapers will, or at least the New York Times, will be in print for a long time. But I mean, if you look at people in airports, like they no longer carry a newspaper when they have their tablet or smartphone to read the New York Times. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that.
Maybe it would be better if rather than specific devices, if I just talk about how the whole wave of devices has affected the. And I'm speaking of the New York Times, by the way, because it's the place that I've spent the last 5 years, which is when things ratcheted up. I suspect somebody from the Journal would have a different conversation. The availability of all the technology has dramatically transformed the way the New York Times operates, and will continue to transform it. It transforms the daily life of a reporter. It transforms the daily rhythms of the newsroom. I mean, and here, I'll tell you what a newsroom looks like today. Is this answering your question? Here's what a newsroom looks like today versus the newsroom that I walked into in 1977 in New Orleans. The newsroom in 1977, you covered a story. Let's say you covered a trial, an important trial. It started at 9. You covered it. You went to lunch when the court went to lunch. If you were an aggressive reporter, you made phone calls, you skipped lunch. You came back, you covered the rest of the trial. The trial ended at 5. You did more reporting to make your story better than the other competitors, and in every city had 2 newspapers then, so that was your only other competitor. So you worked hard from 5 to 7, and then you filed a story, and that was it. That was your story. Now here's covering a trial today. You show up in the courtroom at 10. First off, if you're a really enterprising reporter, you have filed from home a brief opening to the trial that says, Joe Schmo's trial begins today with a little analysis. This is the first trial to derive from insider trading cases on Wall Street, and this is the one that's going to be most closely watched. The key is X, and it's a 500-word analytic piece. That's what you do before you even put your pajamas on. Then you go to the courthouse. You might, if this particular judge allows, you might tweet from the courthouse. You might file a tweet that says, and not every reporter does this, but your generation of reporters will. You might tweet from the courthouse, judge seems agitated with the testimony of witness X. Big surprise, new witness shows up on the witness list, and it's so-and-so. And then when you can actually, some reporters, I actually have colleagues, I cannot imagine doing this, who can then write long stories on their BlackBerries. I'm the previous generation. So you will write you're expected, if it's a big enough story, to write a story for, noonish, depending on what the action was in the trial. You probably are going to update it by the afternoon. And then if you work for the New York Times, which puts a lot of pressure on a reporter, you are going to come back, and the story that you write for the print paper is going to have to take into account that there are people who now know all the highlights of the trial, so you're going to have to give them something different. That's the life of a reporter today. And the newsroom, and that's a much harder gig than the life of a reporter when I started. That's a much harder gig than a reporter than 5 or 10 years ago. And it's changed the way the newsroom operates. I have a deputy who's an associate managing editor who's a former foreign editor, and another I have other deputies, but this guy comes in, the first person, he comes in at 5 in the morning, and his job is to make sure that the website feels fresh to people who look at it at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. And you know, if you want to break a story nowadays, we have a full discussion if we're going to hold it for the print paper. So newsrooms are very, very, very different. You know, we have, what I just described, we don't do for every story. I think we went through a period in the beginning where we tried to do that for every story, and it was, you know, my favorite example of a screw up by me was when you fall in love with a new device, when Sonia Sotomayor had her hearings when she was nominated for the Supreme Court. Newspapers are, because you do everything every day. We live blogged her hearing. It was the dullest. It was horrible. And it suddenly dawned on me at the end of the day, why do we do that? Anybody who cares enough about Sonia Sotomayor's hearing is going to watch it on television. It wasn't interesting. She wasn't asked profound questions. You know, so you know, it was us at our silliest. It began with, I'm not knocking the reporters. I'm knocking me. I set it up. They didn't have any choice. She walks in. She sits down. She says, I'm great. All the Democrats say you're great, and then, well, that's not really journalism. So, but anyway, it's a very different place.
Given all that you said, if I might jump on that. About all that change, which we certainly understand and embrace it, then one thing that surprised me about the letter piece was that it appeared to me that until Jill returned from her sojourn in website land, the afternoon front page meeting really wasn't talking about the website at all. It was just talking about the front page.
Yeah, that's changed.
Right, but not until she
I think that, you know,
seemed later than I would have thought.
Yeah, well, the meeting was later. Newspapers move too slow. There's no question to adapt to the web. I mean, you know, newspapers are dominated by people like me who came up in the world of print, and it's not so much resistance. It's your natural rhythm, right? I had to force myself years ago to start reading online as aggressively as I read the print paper. You know, and to understand that if somebody had something online first, I got beat, and it wasn't just the way I got beat in the print paper. So we were slow, but even though the meetings changed more recently, the paper had already started moving in that direction more quickly than that.
Yes, back here, and then this.
Can you elaborate on the point you made about not confusing building a career with honing a craft?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the most important advice I think I can give. The newspapering, and by newspapering, forgive me, that's a generational thing. I mean journalism, is indeed a craft. It's a craft made up of a bunch of skills that you acquire over time. And no matter how brilliant you are, you can only acquire over time. Some people acquire them in less time, some than others. You've got to learn to write. You've got to learn the instinct to see the world from both sides of a debate. You have to learn to, you have to lose the eye roll, you know, from when you see people who seem ridiculous to you, because history may not judge them that way. You have to learn the basics. My basics from my era, and yours will probably be different, was how to write a lead, how to write it fast, how to get to your point fast, how to write a nut graph, how to write a story that had a kicker. And those were more important to learn than just moving up the ladder to success. And that's what makes newspapering a little bit different. I know a lot of people in the newspaper business who set out to build careers, meaning before they finished learning the craft, they said, well, here's a great opportunity, I'm going to do that next. And a lot of those people never fully learn the craft, and they don't have the bedrock stuff. When I was in the the Tribune Company, for instance, I'm going to call out her name. The guy who's the current editor of the Chicago Tribune, Jerry Kern, knows zero about newspapering. It was staggering to me. He was just a guy who, kept giving the right answers to his bosses. And never, he knows I feel this way, I've said it to him. He was a guy who just gave the right answers to his bosses and never learned how to really be a journalist, to my way of thinking. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
I know that you just mentioned that our gig is going to be a lot harder than the gig that...
Different.
Different.
Right.
Maybe more to juggle is actually what I wanted to touch on. So not only writing with the tweeting and shooting video and
Right.
doing live blogging and doing all that kind of things, how do we, as young journalists, juggle all of those tasks and still maintain the focus on analytical quality reporting and analysis?
This is a question that this is a good question. It's a question that I don't have a complete answer for, because to be honest, we're struggling with this now. I mean, when I was running the Washington Bureau, in the Washington Bureau, this is probably most intense because it remains a place of great competition. I mean, people say the Post isn't what it used to be, but go up against it every day. And it feels pretty goddamn good to me. And then you throw in all these new players, Politico and others. I mean, I do think the distance between us and everybody else has gotten greater. I think we're better because we're the same size and we stuck to our standards. I don't have a complete answer. I mean, some of it is going to be not on you, but on the leadership of the newsroom. And we doubled the number of people who cover the White House, partly because of this. Traditionally, we have 2 people covering the White House. Now we have 4. I used to resist specialization. Now I think specialization for a lot of reporters is a good thing. I used to resist it because it felt like you ran the risk of learning how to do only one thing. But I think if you really specialize, you can do all this stuff a lot easier. I mean, Brian Stelter, who's a young reporter in the newsroom who covers the media, and Brian only thinks about media. He seems to do all this stuff pretty easily, and I think it's because Brian only thinks about media. I think because that's his specialty, he can tweet knowingly, and he can also come back and write the newspaper story the next day knowingly. So I guess that, I mean, I'm still feeling my way around this. This is one of those things we have to solve. We haven't solved it yet. But that's one thing that I've changed my mind about, that having a real specialty makes it easier to write a knowing tweet. By the way, speaking of Twitter, and I've yet to tweet, I saw when I was in one of these, I'm going through this thing now where, because I've not worked in the main newsroom, I spend an hour a week with a different department on the business side, and they teach me about the business side of the paper. And so I was with the people who manage sort of social media. Nick Kristof, the columnist, who is one of the most frequent, if he has so many followers that if he was a newspaper by himself, he would be like the 3rd biggest newspaper. And then his numbers are off the charts. So I don't know how Nick does that. I'd like to have him come and teach me, but yeah, and he does. I mean, now Nick also doesn't have to write a daily story. He's writing a weekly column. But really, if you boiled it down, it's like Nick has more followers than like the Washington Post. So it's like Nick, maybe the Journal or CNN. I mean, it's like the New York Times, maybe the Journal and CNN. I'm going to get this wrong, and then Nick. That's amazing.
There's a new aspiration.
That's right. But they're knowing, and what he's tweeting is journalism. It's not. There's no question that what it is. It's not what I grew up writing, but it's journalism, without question.
Casey.
Actually, Laura and Emily asked my question. questions for me, pretty much. But I do ask another one, which might be a stupid one. When you're talking about the reader's willingness to pay for the content, and that theme is steady, in fact, it continues to go up. And that happens with some magazines, too. They raise prices, and they still keep their readers, some of them. But what about all the other, so is what you're doing, that's great. Is it any model for all of the other papers who are so struggling without any success in making the reader pay more?
I think that.
I mean, some people can't, right? Maybe they're the most important people to reach.
I think that the newspapers that cut themselves so much that they're of less value are going to have trouble making people pay a lot more. I mean, I think that if that's, you know, a lot of us have been arguing that for a long time. The New York Times being able to pay a premium price guarantees to the newsroom, it's the business side saying to the newsroom, we believe you will be high quality, and we're going to charge everybody, we're going to charge a higher price for you than anybody else could envision. And we're not going to let anything, if I just woke up tomorrow morning and went to Jill and said, let's close all the foreign bureaus, the business side wouldn't let us. That's the position you want to be in, right? I think that a lot of newspaper chains, I mean, I think newspapers, a lot of newspaper companies are gonna start to pay the price, because I don't think people are gonna pay a lot of money if you're not good anymore. You know, they were short-sighted. Some newspapers, some cities don't have the economies to support. I mean, you know, there will be some cities that maybe won't have print papers, but will have more. There will be journalism. I mean, I have no doubt of that. There will be journalism committed all across the country. I think it may be different. It will be different. You know, in a city like Newark, New Jersey, where the newspaper's really struggling to survive, you know, is it possible that 10 years from now there will be 3 or 4 very aggressive websites? Maybe even back to your opinion analogy. Some of them more opinionated, some of them more. But I think there will be journalism, you know.
The LA Times, you know, it's probably too late. I mean, some really bad decisions.
Well, the LA Times still, I have to say, the LA Times still, it's not what it's a really good regional newspaper, and it's, you know, the LA Times has the benefit of having historically good journalists and the disadvantage of historically dumb business sides, I think.
A lot of papers.
Right.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your Jerusalem bureau chief, Ethan Bronner, and the fact that he recently.
I had lunch with him the day before yesterday, so.
I recently learned that he accepted a speaking engagement with the Clarion Foundation, a foundation that the New York Times is deemed pretty ultra right-wing and maybe even Islamophobic. To what extent do your journalists have the liberty to express more aggressive opinions, write blogs?
I'm not going to answer the Ethan one, only because, to be perfectly honest, I started in the gig after that became an issue, so I didn't deal with it, so I don't know all of the ins and outs. But I can certainly address the broader question, because I've been in the gig for about 4 weeks. We don't want our journalists expressing their opinions. We are very careful, absolutely rigid about who people speak to. While we do want people, you know, speaking to groups, we do want to be transparent, and we want people to understand our journalism. But we're pretty rigid about, I mean, I'm very rigid about who I speak to. In fact, I only speak to at universities. I don't think I've talked to any place else, and wouldn't. So we're pretty rigid about it. I'm not going to answer the Ethan question, to be perfectly frank, not to punt, but I wasn't in the meetings and discussions because some of that surfaced before I officially started in the newsroom, which is only a few weeks ago. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ernie?
I don't want to take any, if there's someone else.
No, go ahead. We have 5 minutes and then we have to do it. Hard stuff.
Okay, I was intrigued by your comment that the new technology, I mean, that there are certain elements of the craft you have to do. and then there are these new things you may have to learn with the new technology. And I've been interested in looking at your paper. I think it's Kimmelman and a couple of others who are writing these sort of more reflective pieces. You know, the architecture person writes about plays. And so it seems to be, I don't know if it's more interpretive or more essay-like than newsy. And when you said that...
well, those are the critics, remember, right?
Yeah. So I guess maybe that's what I was...
I mean, critics have always had, I mean, the strongest opinion in newspapers has never been on the editorial page side. It's always been in the opinion side. And people always forget, I mean, among the critics, people forget that critics, you know, can write a movie sucks. I mean, they can say it. What you're seeing with Kimmelman, though, is something interesting. I mean, Kimmelman, this is an experiment, and it's worth watching. Kimmelman is the new architecture critic. He's doing architectural criticism in a way that it's never been done before. He's not reviewing the great buildings. He has yet to review the 9/11 memorial. What he's doing is writing a series of essays about how architecture and how it interacts with society. He's done like a design for a new public school in the Bronx, and community centers, and I think it's pretty interesting. And he's writing stuff that we wouldn't have written otherwise.
Hi. I'm always interested in where people look for ideas. So where are you looking when you look for ideas about what to do next?
You know, I think that the best ideas come from reporters, not from editors. That's painful for me to admit, which is why you heard that stutter. I think that my epiphany after I've been an editor for a year or so is that my world had shrunk. My world was now the newsroom, my apartment, my family. So I feel like what my job is to do is to talk to as many reporters as possible. That to me is the managing editor's job, and it drives department heads nuts, but I try to talk to as many reporters as possible. And then in a weird way, if you do that a lot, you start to see ideas coming up. You know, you start to see that the City Hall reporter, I had lunch 2 weeks ago with all of the criminal justice reporters on Metro in New York. And I heard 2 or 3 half-baked ideas, and then I heard them again, different versions of them when I went to the Washington Bureau and had lunch with reporters in the Washington Bureau. So to me, my job is to then pull all that together and say, now that's a real idea. You know, I do try to get out. You know, before I started the job, Jill and I spent 2 weeks, a week in Pakistan and a week in Afghanistan, meeting with, you know, going around with the reporters to watch them as they covered the wars, and meeting with, you know, people on both sides, including a former spokesman for the Taliban. And we walked back with, I told the reporters, Alyssa Rubin, who's the Kabul bureau chief, I said, this is your nightmare. I have like 1 billion ideas in your beat. So I think, but mainly I think my job is to orchestrate ideas from reporters and make sure that they find themselves out. Does that answer?
So I'm going to bring it home with one last question. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to read Jim O'Shea's A Deal from Hell, but you certainly heard plenty about what's happened to this Times, our hometown newspaper. And I wonder if, on reflecting on your departure, would you have done anything differently, or do you feel comfortable with that, or talk a little about that?
You know, I loved LA. Contrary to what people thought, who thought I was a New York Times guy who came here and would head back as soon as I could, I fell in love with it. My son, you know, stayed here and goes to USC, and barely, I have to plead with him to visit us in New York. No, I wouldn't have done anything differently. I thought Tribune Company was determined to cut the LA Times. I thought part of it was, I thought it was short-sighted. I also thought some of it was, to be frank, a bit of a mean-spirited attempt to bring the paper in line. I thought that I couldn't convince them, and I think history proves me right. I couldn't convince them that we were not going to cut our way to some sort of reasonable that we had to figure out a way to grow revenue, and that if we cut every year to meet a cash flow goal, eventually we were gonna. And to be frank, when I walked in the door as managing editor of the LA Times, it had a staff of roughly 1,200-ish. When I left, they also misled me, to be frank. I told David Hiller, the publisher, that I could not put out a great paper and do all the other things we were going to do, which was invest in the web and other stuff, if we went below 900, which is where we were then. That's a big hit. That's 1,200, from 1,200 to 900 and about. Meanwhile, taking on more responsibilities. And to be frank, I think he lied to me. He said, I don't have a number in mind, and he did. Well, I think the paper's like 500 now. So 510. That's, it is a great tribute to the journalists of that paper that paper is as good as it is now. Because boy, they've had a bunch of lousy owners. No, I have no regrets. I have no regrets.
You've been terrific. Thanks.
Thank you.
Here immediately, because there's a job talk, so please be sure to take your lunch stuff.
Stay for the job talk. Oh, thank you. It was fun.